We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today.
A big thanks to all our sponsors: Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Thanks again to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. If you'd like to order some, then give them a call on 01768 210 102. Go to the website mrvickys.co.uk or drop them an email, info@mrvickys.co.uk. A big thanks to United Group Travel. They're a family firm based in Morpeth with pickups throughout the northeast. No strangers on our tours, just people you haven't met yet. They've got a presence on Facebook and a website, unitedgrouptravel.com. If you want to make a booking, give them a call on 01670 632 460 or mobiles 0791 666 4174 0795 71 41654. Thanks to Darren Baldwin Funerals, independent funeral directors. Let us look after you in your time of need. They're based on Old Durham Road in Gateshead, and you can contact them at their website, darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk. Email Darren at darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk or give them a call, 0191 478 2730. A big thanks to Media Arts for all the help with the technical side of things. And a big thanks to New Workwear. You can find them at newworkwear.com. If you want to help the channel, hit the thumb up to subscribe, hit the subscribe button, and share to your other social media. You can also pay a one-off fee of £25 to get a scarf, a cup, a pen, and a membership card. Go to the website, nufcmatters.com, and click membership, or put your smartphone over this QR code. We also support the food bank on this channel. If you want to make some donations virtually, go to nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk and make a donation today. We're also a podcast on Spotify, iTunes, and other podcast providers. Just search NUFC Matters. I'm also a part of the Northeast Footy Brekkie Show. You can listen to that Monday to Friday, 7 till 9 at the nufctoontalk.com.
Critics attack. It feels like I've been talking to myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you.
Good morning, welcome along to NUFC Matters. It's Eddie Howe's press conference review for the Notts Forest game, which takes place today at 5:30 at the City Ground. And Razor started off from BBC Radio Newcastle, asked about Anthony Gordon, how he was. He said that he hadn't trained this week. They don't think the injury is as serious. He will hopefully be back sooner rather than later. When will he start training? I am not sure, said Eddie. He also asked about Alexander Isak. Would he be available for the game today? And he said he won't make this game. We don't have a fixed return, but he is making good progress. Razor then asked about Joe Willock and Elliot Anderson. He said both players were doing well. Said Joe was working hard, but hadn't trained with the group yet. He was working with a sports scientist, and he says Elliot isn't too far away after having a good result on his scan. Razor went straight in at the deep end then about Dan Burn. Obviously, he's had a lot of criticism over the course of the last 7 days, especially on social media, and lots of players, lots of fans, of course, calling for Tino to come on last weekend. And you know, he said there's been a little bit of criticism. Eddie understood it. He says it happens to everyone. He says, of course, everyone has different opinions. He says, but Dan Burn has been a big player for us. It's pivotal how we play. He says, without giving away any of our tactics. He's a big leader. He's very physical, and he's vocally a great player in the dressing room. Been a very big player for us. He's helped galvanise, you know, Newcastle United, but that doesn't guarantee him a place, he said. And Reza then said, well, I guess you can see why fans want to see more of Tino. And he said, yeah, of course, you know, he says, but, you know, he says, it's why I, you know, fought hard to bring Tino Livramento to the club. And, you know, we brought him in as a right back, and he's currently, you know, fighting for that position with Kieran Trippier. But I also love him at left back. He's outstanding there. So, you know, I guess one game at a time was the message that Eddie was trying to get across yesterday. Razor then mentioned Bruno being one booking away from a ban, but yet he still seems to be 100% committed and not pulling out of anything, challenges, etc. And, you know, he's got 9 matches to go and do the same. And yeah, he said, look, Bruno plays like that. You can't change that. He's emotionally committed to the club and to the way that he plays. And, you know, that's what brings the best performances out of him. He's upset with some of the bookings that he's received this season. We can't afford to lose him. We don't want to lose him. He's vital. You just need to look at the crosses he put in for Kieran Trippier to score his goal. And, of course, the ball he put in that, you know, we didn't score from, which Jacob Murphy, which fell to Jacob Murphy last week. He then moved on to the Forest game, Razor, and, you know, basically saying how do you ensure that, you know, what happened against Forest over the Christmas period doesn't happen this weekend. And he said, look, you know, we went 1-up in that game, and, you know, it got away from us. Games sometimes do that. They have the habit of doing that sometimes, and it was a disappointing day for us. But you know, we just have to work hard, stick to our principles, and you know, the rest will take care of itself, hopefully. Wood got a hat-trick, of course, against us, said Razor, but, you know, he's missing this weekend. And Eddie just praised Chris Wood, really. He just said, yeah, look, you know, on the day he did very, very well against us. You know, we saw qualities in him. That's why we signed him. He did a lot for Newcastle United when he was here. He played his big part in keeping us up that season. And he's a quality player. But, yes, he is missing this weekend. That was end of Razor's questions. We moved on to Keith Downey from Sky. He asked him about Wilson. He just said that he trained well this week. He's got his sharpness back. You know, and all being well, he should be okay for today's game. Barnes, as well, was Keith's next question. How's he been this week after the comeback last week? Obviously, scored a goal, and he said, "Yeah, look, it was a good intro for him last week. He's been working hard. He's been very frustrated. You know, the issues that he had with his foot. You know, it was such a strange injury, but that finish summed up, you know, what we'd been missing. It was a big moment in the game for us, and yeah, delighted to have him back." Keith then went down the Dan Burn route. He says, "Is Dan Burn better than, you know, you could have envisaged? Where do you rate him in as far as your signings are concerned?" And he went, "Look, he's right up there with the best signings. You know, it was a difficult market, that market when we tried to sign players, and you know, he was desperate to play for us. But yeah, he's right up there." What do you think about the introduction of blue cards? Was Keith's next question. Eddie said he wasn't a fan. He said, "I thought that's what yellow cards were for." He says it just adds more confusion to the game, and it's something that I wouldn't really be supportive of. Andy Sixsmith was next. He asked about Wilson. The question was based around Wilson and what he'd said about the Luton Town game, the 4-4 draw, and he said it was difficult to analyse. Have you had time to analyse it, and what do you make of it? And he said, "Look, it was, you know," I said, "I wasn't scratching my head what we saw. Sometimes you get games like that, and that's what we got against Luton. He says, we were 1 up, then we were 2-1 up. He says those were the key moments. He says, but then we were 4-2 down, and he says what a response we got from our squad. We got the 4-4. Disappointed in the end not to win it, but you just sometimes get games like that. Your away form had been inconsistent. Now it seems that you've got a little bit of inconsistency at home. It must be frustrating, says Andy. Andy's got this knack of asking controversial questions without making it sound controversial. Eddie just said, look, every time we think we're moving forward, another injury happens. He said, I don't want to place too much emphasis on the injuries, but they have played their part this season. Hopefully we're on our way to improving our away form. And we can get back to where we should be with our home form. But yeah, look, there's been a few scars from this over the course of the last, over the course of the last few weeks, and we just need to make sure that we get things right and get that consistency back. Andy then asked him about the conversation that we've heard this week about over celebrating on the touchline. Of course, Sean Dyche came out and said that he thinks managers and coaching staff should be given a little bit more leeway. Eddie just played it down. He just says, I'll never judge what other teams do. He says, we celebrate in the way that we celebrate. He says, I don't think there's anything wrong with it as long as you're respectful to everybody else. So simple answer from him, which is what we thought we'd get. How vital is it going to be to have Joe Willock back, with the speed and the presence that he has in the midfield? Eddie, just answered it the way he thought he would answer. He's a massive player for us. He's a driving force. But then he said, we've missed all of our players. And he says, you look at the balance that we had last year in the midfield. He says, that's no criticism of the midfield we've got now. He says, but, we had a consistent midfield and back four. And, the difference between last year and this year is... it's there for all to see, but we're still in a fairly good position. Was the lowest point this season Forest defeat? Asked Andy. He said, look, any defeat at home hurts. That day was up there, of course. He says, but we were 1 up, and obviously Chris Wood scores again, and we didn't keep attacking in that game, and that was something that was disappointing. I guess it was completely different at the Luton game where we managed to get ourselves back in it. Alistair was next. Injuries this season, you seem to have one in and one out. You never seem to be, having any luck with that. Can you put that down to anything? Alistair just said no. He said every injury, we have to analyse. He says we've just not been in a position to rotate our squad this season. We've had to get on with it, and that's not the best thing, for any team. Can you put the run of form that you've had down to one particular thing? And again, he just said, look, injuries don't help. You can't make the substitutions you want when players are tired. He says ultimately we have to take responsibility though for what happens. Alistair then says, you said you don't like blue cards. Are there any other innovations in football in recent times that you like or you dislike? And he said, look, extra substitutes are a good thing. He says, that gives us the ability to influence the game a bit more. But he says, there's not many that I've been a fan of. He says, VAR for me was a no-no from the start. He says, but, it hasn't really been a success. He says, there wasn't too much wrong with the game to start with. I always preferred referees to be in control of the game, and that seems to have been taken away from them. Simon was next. Simon was it Simon O'Rourke? I think the season might have been less successful so far than last season, but you still have so much you can achieve. And he said, well, look, there's two ways of looking at the season. He says, we're still in here fighting, or we can say we'll move on to next season and forget about this. And he says, but that's not what we're going to do. He says, we're committed to getting our form back, finishing as high up the league as we can, and going on an FA Cup run. Simon said, do you think this season could be looked at as character building? He says, certainly. He says, the club and myself and the players have learned so much from this season. He says, obviously we need to grow. And the way you grow is by improving your inner self. Damien was next. he went back to the Dan Burn situation. Is there a fine balance that you need to find with the team to play Dan Burn? And he went, yeah, he says, the way we play is intricate, detailed, and we need continuity. He said, and that doesn't mean play the same team. He says, but, we were at our best last year when we weren't chopping and changing. And he says, it's very important that all the players who we pick to play in the team each week understand their roles. So it is a fine balance. Damien then asked what impact the sin bin will have on the blue cards. He's not a fan of it. He just says, I think it'll change things a lot. He says it'll make the game very bitty and stop-start. Chris was next. Basically asked him about the midfield again. Obviously, the dynamic of the midfield, in the injuries that we've gotten there, you might need to adapt. Maybe he's talking about change of formation. He says, we think about lots of things every day. He says, you're going to need to wait and see what we're going to do tomorrow. He says, but the last few games haven't been that bad. He says, we've drawn against Luton. We beat Aston Villa. We beat Fulham. He says, our form's been pretty good. So, we will find a way each week and in each game. Last season when you played Forest, you won after being, a goal behind. And he said, yeah, look, it was a big moment last season. He says, we knew how important that game was. It was a great second half. He says, we often think back to that one and Elliot Anderson's disallowed goal. He says, but, ultimately, you can't take too much from last year's game. We're both two completely different teams going into today's fixture. Lee Ryder was next. Again, back on the Dan Burn. He was saying, he more or less asked the question, does Dan Burn, is his selection down to the fact that he did so well last season? And Eddie said, look, he's got to get a place on merit. No player gets a position on what they did last year. He then emphasised that Dan Burn broke his back this season and he came back early to help the team. He says he scored against Fulham in the FA Cup. He scored against Fulham, He got Villa. He got the man of the match at Villa. He says, but as a player, you're always judged on your last few seconds, which is correct. He says, but, he emphasised the fact that Dan Burn has done a hell of a lot more right than wrong. Do you miss Joe Linton on that side? And perhaps does Dan Burn? And Eddie said, yeah, it's a good point. Joe plays too like two men. He doubles up. He covers space. We have missed his presence. It's the same with Joe Willock, and we've had to adapt. Miley has done so well. He says last week when he dropped into number 6, he was outstanding. But ultimately, we are missing the players because it means that when someone's tired or needs to be replaced, we haven't got the opportunity to bring somebody in. That's down to the injuries again. How good is it having the youngsters train with you? I mean, Eddie, again, enthused about it. He says it's been good for them with the injuries because, it brings youthfulness, energy and, different faces into the first team pool. But you get the impression without him saying it that, obviously would prefer to have his first team choice. But, yeah, good for the youngsters. Craig Hope was next. He says, you're probably going to have to play the same midfield 3 tomorrow. How do you feel about this? And how do you think this maybe has affected the season? And again, it was back to injuries. He said, I don't think there's one thing that's really caused the issues. He says, we've missed all of our injured players. It's not making an excuse, but, I can't criticise Bruno, Sean Longstaff or Louis. He says they're all having good seasons. But obviously when, players, leave everything on the pitch and we can't replace them, it's going to have an effect. Craig wanted to dig deeper on the Joe Willock injury. Can he take us inside his injury? We'd heard this before, but, it was an Achilles first and foremost. Now it's a hamstring injury. And he says anyone who's had either of those injuries know how hard they are to manage. He says, and, we won't know when he's ready until he knows he's ready and until he's back. Will he play in February? Said Craig. I hope so, said Eddie. Jordan asked if Harvey was fit, Harvey Barnes, because he didn't quite get the answer at the start of the press conference. He went, ideally, no. He's not fully fit, but that's been the case with most players this season because of the lack of availability of players. So given the impression there that he's not 100% fit, but he's fit enough to play for us, and he's going to have to play for us. Options, like with the midfield, a limited was Jordan's next kind of question. He says, yeah, I mean, but that's down to injuries. We had an abundance of players last season, whereas this season we are struggling. Jordan then asked him if the rumours of a contract extension for Emil Kraft were true, and he went, yeah, I've got a feeling that might be the case. Scott Wilson was next. Last season, you played against the bottom teams, and you were getting the results. This season you don't seem to be getting them, but you're getting the results against the top teams. Is there anything you can say about that? And he went, well, look, it's a valid question, but he says, I've got to say that win games against the bottom teams don't necessarily mean you're going to win automatically. He says that the pressures and expectations this season were always going to be more difficult, because of where we finished. We got a cup final, we got a Champions League. The expectations were always going to be higher. And he also said he wanted to compliment the crowd. He says they've always been superb, home and away. They've backed us, but we do need to do better. Louise Taylor said last weekend was Green Football Weekend, and the focus was on teams flying. So when does it flying to games, does it concern you? How many flights that football teams take in general? And Eddie just played with a straight bat. He just said, I think we can do more. He says the flying debate, I think, is for other people, but yeah, we need to have consideration. He says at training we do more economically, we recycle, etc. But yeah, we're all for helping the environment. Louise then came out with a bizarre statement about Mike Ashley putting a well into the ground. There was laughter about that, and Eddie said he had no idea about that. She then asked about the new physio, what changes, why the change. He says, we always try to find ways to improve, and we think that this new physio is going to improve things. Luke was next. He just stated the bleeding obvious. He said, on injuries, you can't have another season like this, can you? And he went, no, hopefully not. We went into this season with a squad big enough to deal with demands, but injuries and length of injuries have been the most difficult that we could have imagined. He says we have made mistakes, and we want to do things better. And the injuries, of course, and the fact that Sandro got suspended have affected us massively. Has it been a reality check? And if so, how do you respond? Eddie said, no, I don't see it like that. We don't think we are anything special. He says we're on a journey to compete for trophies and to compete, for a high placing in the Premier League. We're building from inside, and I would disagree with that. Do you think you're on the right trajectory? You went, I think we're on our way to trying to improve internally. And from our perspective, we have to catch up with all these other teams who've had a head start. FFP is going to limit our speed. Dom was next. He said, do you think the Forest playing midweek in the FA Cup will help you? Can you capitalise on that? And he went, having experienced that, it's got no relevance to me at all. Then he went on to players again. He went, have you got a natural left back? He went, Burns a right back. He said Burns a centre half. Tino's a right back. Have you got a natural left back? And he went, natural. Dan Burn is a natural left-footed player, so he is a left back. But he says I'm not fixated with that. He went, Hall has improved. He said we've got Murphy, we've got Dummett, and we've got, of course, Matt Target, who's missed a big part of the season. Kieran was next. He said, have you reviewed the freak injuries? Have you reviewed things? He went, we always look at things. He says, we look at things that we can try and improve. And yeah, he says, look, there's been some big freak injuries. There's been Jacob Murphy's injury, Nick's shoulder injury, and several others. Obviously, Harvey Barnes, the injuries to Elliot Anderson and to Dan Burn. Premier League clubs met to discuss FFP. Would you welcome any changes? There was one or two laughs at this because he went, yes, and that was that. And a short answer to Kieran's question. Oscar from the Sun was next. Back to Dan Howe. Back to Dan Burn. He says, how's he coping? He went, look, criticism's a strange thing. He says, I'm sure I get it in the wider world. He says, but I don't know what is said about me. I don't know what Dan's exposed to. He says, but I urge my players to keep away from social media and reports and reviews. He's an experienced player. And as long as Dan gets and feels the love internally, I'm sure he'll be fine. Do you encourage players to keep away from social media reviews? Yes, said Eddie. How important is it to qualify for Europe this season? Eddie said, I'd love to do it, and he followed it up with, do you think it'll be harder to attract players if you don't? And he says, or keep a hold of players. He said, I'd love to qualify for Europe. He says, I still feel we can attract players and keep players. But of course, our motivation is to finish higher in the league. Then talking about the broken back situation that he'd mentioned earlier, which again was Dan Byrne. He went, yeah, he says it's the technical term for the injury that he had. He says, I thought he damaged himself against Fulham as well. He landed on his back badly. He says he's shown tremendous courage, played in discomfort, and he's got through this injury, and led by example. How's he been this week? Was the next question. Typical Dan. He's been great. He always adds energy to training sessions, and his leadership is second to none. And then again, started talking about the news this week about two football fans who've been up in front of the judge. One, of course, who assaulted Eddie Howe at Leeds. And Eddie just said it was a worrying trend. He says, I saw the ref being chased off the pitch. He says, these kind of things can't happen. And he says, the Leeds moment, he says, it was forgotten early by me. He says, I was, trying to process it and think about what was going on. He says, but yeah. He says, what we don't want is, for something more serious to happen. And then people saying, well, we did have examples of this. We did see this, coming. He says, we don't want anybody put in that position. Simon was next. He says, you mentioned earlier that mistakes have been made. Who's made them? He just said, look, collectively, it's not an individual who's made a mistake. We all make mistakes. And he says, some come from the too much load. The programs might not have been as good in the gym. He says, but we have to sit down as a team, and it's not a particular department, it's a collective. What will change? We will improve what we deliver for players. And demands going up physically, games getting more and more, and strategies need to improve. That's basically what he said. So big press conference, that enjoyable one, 40 minutes long. So yeah, we got a lot out of it. Morning to Trolls, Roger, to Les, to Paul. And that is Eddie Howe's press conference. Enjoy the game. It's a 5:30 kickoff tonight. And I will be back with the professionals tomorrow. Take care, guys.